You're listening to Beloit Podcast.
On this episode of the Beloit Podcast, we have Evan Fitzgerald, president of Kubb United, back as a guest to teach us all about the game. Last time we had Evan with us, we learned the history of the game, also Evan's personal history with the game, how he came into Kubb, and other basic information about how the game is played. Today, we'll learn about teams, how to set up a game, some of the rules, and most importantly, how to win. But before we go any further, let's get the full details on the Kubb US Open 2017.
Enjoy the sounds of summer and catch the thrill of knocking wood blocks over with wooden stick and making new friends from all over the United States. Join us at the second annual US Kubb Open sponsored by DuPont at Riverside Park in Beloit on August 5th. Teams need to be registered by 8:30 a.m. and championship finals will start around 4 p.m. Kubb is spelled K-U-B-B. Hello, this is Evan Fitzgerald, 2015 U.S. National Kubb Champion, and I am inviting you to join us. Kubb is a fun and exciting Scandinavian long game that is gaining popularity. It can best be described as combining the skills of horseshoes and bowling, and is sometimes referred to as Viking chess. Registration is $40 and teams are made of 2 players. All ages and abilities are welcome. Even if you have never played before, you will find that players are very welcoming to teaching new players, and by the end of the day, you'll be playing like a Viking. Visit Beloit will be hosting their 4th annual Rock, Paper, Scissors tournament starting at 10:30 a.m. in the park that day. Bring out the kids and compete for fun and medals. This event is presented in support of the Visit Beloit JET Tourism Grant. You can register at KubbUnited.com. Click on the US Kubb Open link to register and find more details. Look for the Rules of Kubb page where you will find a video of how to play and a downloadable poster explaining the rules in even more detail. Also, you can join us on Tuesday evenings at the Rock Bar and Grill in Beloit from 6:30 to 8 p.m. where we will be playing and teaching people from the community.
I asked Evan to teach me Kubb, everything basically that it would take for me to enter into the Kubb Open coming up August 5th. We set up a game in my backyard, which of course I figured would give me what they call the home field advantage. It did not. After Evan and I played a couple games and after I better understood the game, my kids came out and I started to practice with them. And luckily enough, our oldest is going to be my teammate for the Open. So we'll see how it goes when me and my teammate hit the scene at the Open. Let's see how good my announcer voice is today. The US Kubb Open 2017.
Kubb.
Back with Evan Fitzgerald, president of Kubb United. Evan, how's it going today?
Great. It's a beautiful day.
It is. So we're going to set up a game of Kubb. We're going to learn the game, as many aspects as we can fit into one podcast. Setting up the game, we're going to start there. When we set up a game, what's the first thing we would need to do before we actually set it up? Can we just set up on unlevel playing ground, side of a hill? What are some things we need to consider before we set up?
Sure, yeah, probably the biggest thing you want to have is a level playground. Level as possible. A little bit of a slant on the hill isn't too bad. I think it's a more enjoyable game the more level of a field you have. Definitely nice grass area with a good dirt base behind it. Seems to be the best way to play.
So what do we got here? What's the space that we're taking up? Is it 10 by 10, 20 by 20?
It's 8 meters by 5 meters, which is 26 feet by 16 feet. So for the long end that you're going, that's the 8 meters. And then the field's actually kind of divided into 2 sections. So you have the center line, which is 4 meters from where you start to throw. So you have the king set up in the center, and that designates where the center line is. All your action is going to be thrown towards the other side to that kind of 4 meter by 5 meter section that's on the opposite side of what we call the pitch. So the court that we play on here is referred to as the pitch. And then your opponent's obviously the side that's closest to you. That's the side where your opponent, all his action is going to be thrown towards you inside this section here on our half of the pitch.
I noticed you didn't need much to measure this. Is this something you get used to after a while, kind of the general layout of it? What do you recommend people do just to get the pitch set up?
Okay, yeah, so like right now I just kind of guessed here, but typically what I've done is, and this one's probably a little bit shorter that we're doing here today, but we actually have a measuring system. It's kind of a string base that we roll out, kind of creates a triangle, which gives you a right angle on there that get the 8 by 5 meters, and you flip it over and you do that. So that's one way. So that's something that if you contact us at KubbUnited.com, we can either tell you how to make them or send some to you. The other option is like people use tape measures to actually measure it out and work that.
So having a Kubb set, I should have started there. We need an actual Kubb set, so where do people go to get those?
You can actually contact us at KubbUnited.com. We sell a kind of a, what we call more of a recreational set, but it has the same measurements and dimensions of the tournament sets. It's made out of Douglas fir. We sell those for $50. If you want to get the actual tournament sets like we use at the US Open, that's a guy named JP's Backyard Games, a friend of mine out in Chaska, Minnesota, and he ships those around. And the other ones I'd kind of recommend is there's a group called Country Kubb out of Ohio. They're the ones that I would say would make the actual recreational sets. It's a little tricky on Amazon recommending there because there's so much variability, price, size, quality. A lot of times they say it's tournament regulation and it really isn't. So if you ever have any questions, please contact us. Go out to KubbUnited.com, find our email, and we'll be happy to talk you through or give you our advice on a set that you're looking to purchase.
That's what I did. I went to Amazon because I thought that would be a good place to see what's out there, and there's a lot on Amazon for Kubb. Let's talk about the teams real quick. What are the options for teams? What are the rules and regulations for teams and players?
Yeah, that's one of the really awesome things about Kubb. It's very flexible. You can play one-on-one. So if there's only two of you, obviously your practice, you can play by yourself. But, if you're playing against, you just need to have one person on each side and make a team. But you can also play all the way up to 6. So you can have 6 players on each team.
All right.
The tournament we run, it's going to be two players tournament. And there are 3-player tournaments out there. Some people play a 4 or 5. So it's real flexible, but it's usually, if you're playing in a tournament, the tournament will designate like what the minimum number of players can play on that team. But then if you're in the backyard, it's nice because it's variable. You'll see 12 people playing in the backyard.
I asked you about the pieces, but what if I wanted the actual Viking skulls and bones? Where do I find those?
You probably have to find some archaeological digs in Denmark or something.
We'll pass. Let's talk about the individual pieces. I noticed we have 3 different sizes from what I can see here, but explain each of the pieces.
So let's start with the batons. This is the object that you're going to throw and try to knock down the blocks. So the batons are typically about 1 foot in length. The ones we use are 1 3/4. That's the regulation size. Sometimes I've seen some sets 1.5 inches, 1 1/4. And that's the thing, like when you're on Amazon, you got to watch is those sizes really vary a lot. The ones we're going to play here today, and pretty much every event I've been to, is 1 3/4. It's basically just a dowel. We've routed off the edges, so it gives it a little bit kind of rounded. That serves 2 purposes. When it hits the ground, it skips better, because if you have if you don't route the edges, it'll hit the ground and just kind of dig in, and sometimes that's not as enjoyable as play. The other thing is it keeps it from splintering or chipping as much with the routed edges. The next piece we have is the Kubb that we have, but that's a block of wood. And so we're using the batons to throw and knock down the Kubbs. And the Kubbs are about 6 inches in height, 2 3/4 inches in width. So it's a rectangular block. It gets stood up on kind of like the short edge is on the bottom. So, so you kind of picture just a tower or block, is how you stand those up. The set I have here, we have painted half white, half red. And that's just more for decoration. It also helps a lot with team communication, because when you get to a phase of the game where you actually have to stand them up, you can say, okay, stand red side up or white side up. But for the most part, it's just decoration with how we painted these. And then the main piece of the game, and this is kind of like sinking an 8-ball in pool, for example, and that is the king. A lot of times you heard this game referred to as Viking chess. Part of it is because you have these Kubbs that I mentioned. People say those are the knights, while you have your attacking pieces, the batons, but then you have the kings, the one that you're really trying to defend. So what you're trying to do is take out all of the Kubbs, and then you go after the king. And the king is about a foot in the height. I think it's like 3.5 inches wide. Typically, sometimes they vary a little bit. But then there's very decorative. So like in our case, we have a kind of like a crown. We've cut it in a piece so it looks like a crown. That's one of the fun things people take a lot of liberty with. I've heard of somebody I just talking the other day who says they made the Lombardi trophy out of it. so that's just more of a decoration. It's the last piece that gets knocked down in the game and designates the winner.
That puts us to the pitch. I want to ask, how do you decide who throws the initial pitch for the game?
So each team will take one of the batons. So they'll stand opposite of each other on this side. Typically somebody will count to 3, and that king that's sitting in the center of the pitch. So you count to 3, and you'll each throw the baton towards the king. Whoever's baton lands closest without knocking down the king, then that is the team that gets the choice of throwing first or picking which side of the field they want to play.
There's so many different aspects of this game that would probably benefit from having a referee around for these games. Do you guys do refs for the Kubb games?
Yeah, the U.S. Kubb Open, the one we're doing Beloit, actually does have a referee. It's the only tournament that has what we refer to as active referees, where they're actually trained to look for certain violations, or even really trained to, if people have questions, how to set them up. So we're the only one that really does that. But typically, it's kind of what we refer to as a passive referee. A lot of times, it's self-refereeing, so the teams determine. That's where most of the tournaments and most of the leagues you'll do. It is a very friendly game, so in most situations that works really well. The other option is kind of what we refer to as an observer or the tournament director. So if anybody has any questions, they can ask them. If they happen to see a violation and somebody has a question and say, hey, I thought it was a violation, the other team says, no, it wasn't, then they would share their opinion. Something that Ultimate Frisbee does, are pretty common, but those are the different officiating methods. But I'd say most of the time it's self-refereeing.
What are some of the common things that you would see that a person would want to point out? We said before, I was asking you about throwing the baton. If it goes sideways and doesn't get thrown properly, is that something that we would point out in a game, especially if it happened often? What would you point out that would be a common mistake that a player could make?
Yeah, that's probably one of the most common. Is the idea is you have to throw the baton with a vertical rotation, and so not like what we call horizontal, which would be almost say picture a helicopter blade. You're given up to a 45-degree angle, which is a pretty big variation. So we always encourage people to throw it vertically as possible. It makes it easier for the other team to determine if it's legal, or even the referee. It just seems to be a friendlier game when everybody's really trying to keep it vertical and not try to push that limit of that 45-degree rule we have.
Can you be out of bounds? Can you get called for throwing your baton out of bounds?
Yeah, so along the sidelines, kind of the long side of each of the pitch, both feet have to be within those boundaries. So yeah, you can be called if your feet are standing out. Now the other thing is you can't do is if you begin your throw and then your motion carries you out of bounds, that is also illegal. So with your throw, you have your feet have to be in bounds behind the throwing line that you're throwing from, and you have to maintain your balance to where your motion isn't carrying you over the line after the throw.
So explain the different phases.
Okay. Yeah, so you have the initial phase of the game like we talked about, which is the toss to the king to see who goes first. Now then, whoever goes first, that's the team that's going to throw the batons. So on each side of the field, you have 5 of the Kubbs set up. They're 8 meters apart, and that basically becomes your throwing line. You have to throw from behind the Kubbs or stand up. So the team that begins is going to throw 2 batons to start the game. We originally used to have it to where the beginning team could throw 6 batons, but as teams got better and better, it became too big of an advantage to start the game that way. So now we have a rule that says the beginning team will throw 2 batons. They throw those 2, and that becomes basically the throwing phase. Once both those batons have been thrown, then the other team will pick up the blocks, and that's when they become into what's called the basically the casting phase or the Kubb throwing phase. So they're actually going to pick up any blocks or Kubbs that have been knocked down. They will gather those up, stand behind their baseline, behind their set of Kubbs, and throw those to the opponent's other side of the field to there. And then once that is complete and they've actually thrown them to where both the blocks can be raised in bounds, then the defensive team will move up and set those blocks up. When you set them up, you have to set them up in a way that you have to picture like there's a hinge on both sides of the block. So you're not allowed to just like lift the block off the ground and move it and twist it and things like that. You're supposed to set the block up in a way that you have basically 2 choices. If you're looking at the block, you can go to the left or the right, but that's.
You find a pivot point basically on the block and you can go from there?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, so it'll be laying on the ground on its long side, and then basically you have to stand it up so it's on its short side. So that team, the defensive team, will stand those up, then they have to leave the field. And that's the thing, is you can't throw until the other team has actually left the field. It's a safety concern. That's another thing the referees are watching.
Yeah, you don't want to hit your opponents in the head.
Right. They don't like that. Plus, it gives them a chance to watch your throws to make sure you're throwing them legally as well. Then once those blocks have been raised, now that team that has the baton, so in the next round, they're going to have 4 batons to return on that round. So round 1 had 2 batons, round 2 has 4 batons. They will take their 4 batons, and they have to knock down the ones that they've just thrown to the other side. They have to knock those down with how many ever batons it takes them out of the 4 before they can then go after the 5 that are along the baseline. So that's kind of becomes the critical part. So once those cubes have been stood up in the field, they're actually called field cubes. So I'll refer to field cubes versus baseline cubes. So the field cubes have to be knocked down before the baseline cubes are, okay? So then once their throwing phase is completed and they've knocked down field cubes, let's say they knock down both the field cubes and one of the baseline cubes in the back, then the other team will gather up those 3 cubes that have been knocked down, and they enter into that casting phase again, and they throw it back to the other side, and you repeat. And the game repeats in that type of,
the different phases.
Right, yeah, and those phases, it just kind of keeps repeating until somebody has been able to throw them over, knock down all the field cubes, any remaining baselines are in the back, and if they have a baton left, they can topple the king that's in the center, then they win the game.
And that's it.
That's good.
Why don't we try a game? That's what I think.
Absolutely.
Let's do this.
Yeah.